Get off the Wi-Fi. I don't know what the phone on. I said it's right, mate. We're on Facebook Live now. Go on there. Facebook Live on. Yeah.
Are we in the class? Are they we need to send a link to
Yeah,
if you can.
Can you do me a favour?
I'm on your
Mark.
page, so
Mark, can you do me a favour? Can you just check make sure the sound's working alright?
9 o'clock. Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Yep. Wow, that's really nice. Okay, so tweet them in.
Sure, book.
It's just Nick's just sending it to the back and then we'll go on the back.
I'm trying the old stream still, right?
Good evening. Can you all hear? Good. Okay, well, welcome to this SGM. My name's Mark Davis. I'm chair of the Dons Trust. Tonight is an SGM, not an AGM. The annual general meeting will be on the 8th of January, by which the accounts should be ready. First of all, some apologies from absent Dons Trust board members, in particular Jane Lonsdale and Roger Evans. Jane's asked me to pass on some words I'll mention in a minute, but also we've had apologies from David Grounds, our secretary, who had a long-standing engagement. So welcome back as secretary for one night only, Tom Brown. So Jane Lonsdale has, I'll make sure that her statement is included in the minutes, but she's had a long-standing prior engagement which she just couldn't back out of. But she knows how important these meetings are to members. She knows how important the issue of fan ownership is and referred to previous surveys on that subject in which fans have referred to that. And she really wants to know what our members think. So she will be looking back carefully on the video of this evening because it is so important. But unfortunately, she cannot attend tonight, but will attend an open meeting next Monday, and is happy to take feedback at her email address, jane.lonsdale@thedonstrust.org. So we are videoing tonight. I think we may or may not be videoing live, possibly on Facebook, and it'll be recorded. So if you don't want to be videoed, then don't ask any questions. We've got 3 formal agenda items, but in practice, one of them is going to take up a large proportion of the meeting. Some of you are standing, it's hot. I want to get us out by 10:30. I hope we can do that. And we'll have a quick refreshment break around 8:45. So without ado, I shall move on. First of all, apologies that we don't have minutes of the September SGM. We have a busy secretariat and that hasn't yet happened, so those will get carried forward to the AGM. So the first formal bit of business that we're going to do tonight is the election results, and I shall hand over to John Dolan, Chair of the Election Steering Group.
Thank you, Mark. Just a quick few words to start with, because we had a somewhat unusual election this year, in that a week before the voting closed, one of the Dons Trust Board members resigned midway through a term. And one of my functions as the chair of the SG is to work through what the options for the board are. And there were 3 options that I looked at. Number 1 was to hold a by-election. We have done that in the past, about 2004. Interest was minimal, and the winner was elected with about 300 votes, which normally doesn't get you anywhere near being the most successful loser. Also, it would be dragging on to about February or March, and as I was already aware, not what the issues were, but things were going to be busy. Option 2 was to allow the board to co-opt a person to occupy the election position. I was a bit dubious about that because there are quoracy rules for the board that allows for certain votes being limited by the number of elected members who are involved. So there were two issues with that, the democratic deficit and in fact the working, particularly as the board was losing another member. The third option, which we adopted about 3 or 4 years ago when Chris stood down, was to effectively make the next person on the list to occupy the 1-year slot. Last time we had a little bit more notice and I was able to include that in the election material. This year I didn't, but it still seemed to be the quickest and easiest and at least have some democratic credibility. So I put that to the secretary. We shared it with some of the continuing board members. Then on the Sunday before the vote, I shared it with Neil Springate, with David Grounds, who was already aware, but David and I shared it with Neil Springate, the independent observer and verifier, and he was happy with the option of choosing number 6. And the rest of ESG bought into it there, very strongly supported. So that's how we finished up with 5 people elected for 2 years and 1 person to fill the Rob Crane's position to the this time next year, in the election next year. So moving on to the election results. Then the leading candidate was Jane Lonsdale with 736 votes, Mark Davis 670 votes, Edward Leake 590 votes, Tim Hillier 547, Graham Stacey 493, all elected for 2 years, Anne Williams 470 for 1 year, Dennis Lowndes 455 and Mark Sturgis 306. Now, normally the changeover would be at the AGM. I was aware the AGM was being delayed, and I asked if we could actually make this an AGM and then adjourn sine die, but it turns out that unless all the papers are available, you can't do that because you can only resume if the papers have been made available at the first one. So then the question is, do we run with a what's effectively a lame duck board with 2 vacancies and 2 people who are standing down, or, which I'm not, it's about the only thing we can do is that Mark will now lead into the vote as to changing over at this stage.
Okay, thank you, John. So thank you to John and all the election steering group and indeed our independent scrutineer, Neil Springate. So there is a resolution to give effect to what John just said, and that says to approve that, notwithstanding that the 9th December 2019 general meeting is a special general meeting rather than an annual general meeting. 1, the appointment of board members due to retire at the 2019 AGM should cease at the moment the 9th December meeting is closed. And 2, the appointment of the board of members who have been elected in the 2019 elections should take effect at the moment the 29th December meeting is closed. And 3, responsibility for the 2018-19 accounts rests with the outgoing board. Are there any questions on that before I seek a show of hands? I'm not seeing a lot of questions. Can I ask for a show of hands in favour of that motion? Any against? No. Any abstentions? Oh, sorry, there was one no, possibly. Any abstentions? No. Okay, so that is passed. So thank you for that. And just for as a point of information, on the proxies there were 36 in favour, none were against, and 14 at the chair's discretion or proxy's discretion. So thank you very much to the outgoing members, actually board members, Colin Dipple, Roger Evans, Cormac van der Hoven, and you'll have seen, not through retirement, but as a matter of resignation, Rob Crane. Thank you to the candidates who stood. Welcome to the incoming board members, Anne Williams, Graham Stacey, Tim Hillier, and the continuing board members. Any board members who haven't yet been mentioned, or just actually any Don's Trust board members in the room, just wave your hand in the air and say hello to the membership, please. Okay, thank you. So, that brings us on to the next piece of business, but I'm just going to turn on a projector and a computer screen, so please give me a minute. Okay, sorry for that slight delay. So I'm joined this evening by various members of the Stadium Committee, but I shall probably be calling on our Chief Executive, Joe Palmer, and on my fellow Don's Trust Board colleague, Edward Leake, during the course of the discussions, and probably one or two others as well. I've been chairing a weekly meeting of the Stadium Committee since March to oversee the project. I'm grateful to all the other members too, including Colin, Roger, Rob, Tom, and we have our project manager, Joe Giordano, at least for some here of this evening. Before we dive into the detail, I want to make a few introductory remarks. First of all, of course, I would love to be able to tell you today that we've raised all the money for the new stadium, that we've signed the contract, and that we're full steam ahead to start next season in our completed 9,000-seat stadium. I'm afraid I can't tell you those things. As you've read, we don't yet have all the funding in place, and so we're not yet ready to sign the contract with Buckingham. We need to do both soon in order to maintain progress. So first, let me apologise that we're not where we ought to be right now, or where we expected to be, and that as a consequence we're having to consider some choices we didn't expect to be making right now. That news has caused some anxiety to our members and AFC Wimbledon supporters, and I apologise for that. I've read a few theories online suggesting we've deliberately put ourselves in this position in order to force certain choices, or that we've held back information so as to force decisions through without time for deliberation. Neither of those things are true, and I can assure you that when we got our consent to sell Kings Meadow and more recently to issue shares, it was our expectation and intention that we'd succeed in financing the stadium without compromising our future or structure. Indeed, we structured the Cedars transaction consistent with that so as to maintain 75% control. Until a few weeks ago, we thought we would reach that position. Lenders were going to their credit committees. We expected to raise more equity. We would have signed the construction contract. All of that seemed very likely just a few short weeks ago. There's a parallel universe where we're probably patting ourselves on the back right now, but unfortunately we're in this universe. And also, we've always had to get our communications and tone right with our stakeholder audience as well as with our fans, and that always does give a bit of a dilemma as to how and what and when we communicate what we have to communicate. But once it was clear that the risks of not getting where we needed to be were high, the boards decided to bring the situation to your attention, and we did so as quickly as we could. The content and timing of these comms is fraught. We're not communicating to our members in a vacuum. What we say has an impact on our dealings with other parties to the project. There are things that we need to keep commercially confidential. Things are moving very fast, actually, and there's a question of how much we should say when some of the information we present becomes out of date very quickly. But we have put together some further information since the SGM papers went out. A lot of you have read the open letter setting out over 50 questions that a collection of supporters put together. It was a good list, thank you, and we answered it as fully as we could. We haven't answered many other questions in the meantime. We're keeping the project moving forward at the same time as communicating with you about it, and we have to balance out the workload, but tonight will no doubt give an opportunity for us to answer further questions. We're at a difficult point in time for this project and for the club, but we've got through difficult times before and we'll do so again. We need to keep pulling together and show the world we're a united club. So I'm going to take this agenda item in two parts. First of all, what is the current situation? And then the second part will be, well, where do we go from here? And we'll take Q&A and discussion at the end of each of those parts. In fact, we'll probably do a break between the two parts. I want to avoid dwelling too much on history. We need to discuss where we are today and where we go from here, but doubtless you'll ask some questions about how we got to where we are. So we face some crucial decisions. We want to hear your views on what to do next so we can put the right choices to you formally, but no formal decisions will be made tonight. Finally, this is a complex project and a complicated situation. There are going to be lots of opinions on what the right thing to do is, and it shouldn't be surprising that there'll be a range of views not only among the membership, but also among the board. The board has a common understanding of what the facts are and what the options are, but there's inevitably a range of views on what the best way forward is, and I will try and present the options as objectively as I can. So one thing I did while I was putting these slides together, and I've included some of them, is I looked back at what it was we told you back in the meeting on the 3rd of June as the pre-launch for the crowdfunding, and also when we talked about financing at the last SGM. I thought it'd be helpful to run really quickly through some of the slides, or the slides I showed you back in June, just to baseline where we thought we were, was it 5 months ago now, or 6 months ago? So, the journey so far, it's been a long journey. Started with looking for a site for the football club, getting a local plan, coming to an exclusivity arrangement with Galliard, who's developing the project with us, designing a stadium. Somebody said 20,000 would be a good number. That was a design we went for. There was planning. There were all the commercial arrangements with the developer. We sold this place. And we procured contractors. So that was a long journey starting many years ago, many people to thank. Where are we now, or as of June? the freehold of the site, planning permission, a design for a stadium, a firm price for building it. The contractor was on site. That's what it looked like in June. We had most of the funding. We didn't have all of the funding. And we had one season, this season, left at this stadium. It was a £30 million project, and that's everything to date from day one. And we'd secured funds from the sale of this stadium and from Merton Catalyst, who under a Section 106 agreement. That's the neighbouring developer. And we intended to raise a further £13 million. And we said that was bank loan of somewhere between 6 and 10 million and shares of somewhere between 3 and 7 million from fans, but also some others too in the wider community. So I went through in June, why did we need to raise so much? And in short, the answer was because we told you back in 2015 that we thought the number would be somewhere between 3 and 7 million pounds. The paper we sent out for the SGM goes through the reasons. We had delays, and as a result, costs went up during those delays. We've encountered a few additional costs along the way on clearing the land and things like that. So the costs have gone up over time. We haven't gold-plated the stadium by any means, and at times we've had to chop bits off it, indeed, to keep it within budget. We talked about, can we raise that much? And I acknowledged that £7 million of crowdfunding was a lot of money to raise, but there were reasons why we should be hopeful and go for as much as we possibly could. We also talked about what if we couldn't raise that much, and we talked about the fact that we might have to make some quite painful choices on chopping bits of the stadium out. I asked you not to put us in that position by giving as much equity as you could, and thank you to those who did. We went through why there were reasons why people would want to buy shares in AFCW at the time. That was just the pre-launch of the Cedars campaign. I won't go through that now. I reminded the corporate structure. And we talked about what was happening next, working at speed in order to secure and document commitments from lenders, to finalise the variations to the planning permission, the crowdfunding, signing a construction contract, and also that we'd be consulting on the stadium experience to keep us on track for a summer 2020 opening. So that's where we were in June. Where are we now? Well, we've got construction in progress. You can see the steel structure of the West Stand there. We haven't signed the full construction contract, the JCT, which is Joint Construction Tribunal contract or something, that's a construction contract. But we've done signed contracts for initial works that will become part of that, and it's £11.5 million of the 26 million. It's possible we could do a further one. We'll have to figure out whether that's the right thing to do in terms of where we are cash-wise. Since June, our Section 73 planning variation has become unappealable. No one took us to judicial review, and we've got a minor amendment in process. On funding, we've had one indicative offer of a loan in the meantime, and of course we did the crowdfunding, and we'll come back to both of those. So those are the main developments since June. The construction contract, well, we've got the £26 million contract, but then we've got another £1 million or so of provisional items. We're still reviewing one or two bits of the scope, what's in, what's out, having a friendly discussion with one of our neighbours about something they want us to build, and then we've got the IT, the furniture, fixtures and fittings, and all the consultants and all the legal spend and everything to date, and that takes it to £31.5 million. That doesn't include the kitchen, which is fitted out by the catering contractor, and it doesn't include the finance costs either. So in terms of sources of finance, well, Merton Catalyst are paying us £14 million. That's a matter of public record. We're eligible for an additional grant from the Football Stadium Improvements Fund of £0.2 million. We've got the net proceeds of selling this stadium, which was 7.6 million altogether. We had some costs. We had including paying Kingstonian and repaying a previous loan. And as some of you will have read, that some has been used to support the operating budget, or the playing budget here actually, so that we give us the best possible chance of still being in League One by the time we return, by the time we go to Plough Lane. And so that's 3.6 net. Some of it's historic costs that we've long ago written off, and that gives a total sources of funding to date of 18.1 million. And that means we need to raise 13.4 million. We did just over 3 million through the crowdfunding and some equity, some share capital that someone has pledged outside of the Cedars funding itself, although that's not one of the investors that we're going to talk about later. So we're looking for about 10.5 million plus whatever the finance costs during the period before we operate the stadium are. So call that £11 million. There's various possible sources of finance. We could borrow the money potentially, and we went through this in September, but you can get a short-term development loan that we'll have to refinance very quickly. That's one option. You can get a longer-term loan, such as a commercial mortgage. And we're also following up an option for what's called a sale and lease back, where you sell the grounds to an institutional investor, lease it from them over something like 50 years, and at the end of 50 years you can buy it back for £1, which is a very attractive, if available. The terms of that are very attractive because that's the kind of income stream they're looking for. They tend to be index-linked, these deals. They go up with inflation, but with a low nominal interest rate. Then there's share capital, equity, and we've done a crowdfunding, and we'll come on to this in part 2. There's also other investors out there. And then there's various other things, donations, another Dons Trust bond, seat debentures and stuff like that. So with all these options, what's the problem? So the problem number one is we need to sign the construction contract by January, and we need to demonstrate to our contractor that we've got the money to pay them for the commitments we're entering into. And if we don't do that, and if they have to demobilise, then remobilising them would be expensive and risky. A delay of, and we've put 3 months, we don't actually know what this is, but there is a point where if you delay a certain level, then the FA will just say, no, you can't move mid-season, you've lost the whole season before we move back to Plough Lane. And we don't have an alternative ground to play in for next season. A full season may be more difficult to negotiate than just a few weeks delay, and hiring a ground will cost money and reduce revenues. We don't yet have an alternative ground to play in next season because we haven't really been trying very hard to have an alternative ground to play in for next season, because actually if we proceed, then in some shape or form we should be able to play at Plough Lane from next season. At the beginning of the season we might be watching your shoulders don't rub against the paintwork and stuff, but there should be something that would be ready for the start of the season. So the next bit of the problem is we don't yet have a loan offer that we can really rely on. We've had one indicative offer, which is subject to valuation and due diligence. We've got some promising leads, actually, quite a number of promising leads, but it's not the first time I would have said that. We've had lots of promising leads over a period of time, but we don't currently expect to be able to borrow the £11 million I talked about. And I don't think there's one single reason for the reason we don't yet have an offer of debt that we can really rely on. Sometimes it's football and clubs such as Bolton and Bury and the difficulties. Sometimes we have Brexit, the economic climate. it's a stadium, it's a football club, we're a bit weird, what's this community benefit society that owns us, what's the crowdfunding? So it's not like there's one single reason, but we haven't got it yet. And even if we do get a loan, we're not going to get £11 million and there'll still be a funding gap. And then the further point is that borrowing is risky. If we do a short-term development loan, it'll have to be refinanced. And if we can't refinance it, then we're in trouble. The more we borrow, the tighter our cash flow becomes, and the tighter the debt service comes, and the less money we have for the playing budget. And there's also a question of who we're happy to borrow from, because the more money you owe, the more the lenders have you potentially buy the short and curlies, and people have talked about what are the consequences of investors controlling decisions of the football club. We also have to bear in mind that lenders have various forms of control, and the more you owe them, the more control they have. So we put together, and this is conceptual and probably not brilliant for people who are colourblind, but apologies for that. But we put together some indication of what is loan amount. If we just took a bog standard commercial mortgage, say 15 years, and borrowed different amounts of money, where would that put us in either League One or League Two? And what it shows us is that in League One, which is the red, I think, then if we borrowed £11 million, we would clearly have the lowest playing budget in the league. Borrowed £7 million would put us around 22nd. Now, this doesn't factor in everything. It doesn't factor in transfer income. It doesn't factor in FA Cup runs and things. So actually, you know, 7 million. You can probably stretch it a bit, but you get the impression. 4 million would put us something like 19th, and no loan would put us something like 17th. And move to the right as you start to factor in some of those other revenues. And the League Two budget, £11 million loan, would make us the lowest even in League Two. Something like 22nd in League Two if it's 7 million, 21st if it's 4 million, and 12th if we had no loan. But then, as I say, factor in other revenues, it may get, hopefully that would go to the right. But still, there is a real trade-off between how much we borrow, the terms on which we borrow, and where we would be in terms of playing budget. So that's for a commercial mortgage. If we get a long-term sale and lease back, it would look better than that. And we are working on that, among other options. But there's no guarantees that we'll get one. So